8. Horse Sand Fort. Off the coast of Portsmouth, England in Solent Strait, a strange circular armor-plated structure measuring 200 feet, 61 meters in diameter, is visible from the shore. But it seems a world away as it rusts among the waves. Known as the Horse Sand Fort, it's one of 4 structures called the Palmerston Forts that were built between 1865 and 1880 in response to the threat of a seaborne invasion from France. Today, the Horse Sand Fort is visibly decaying due to the point of almost being an eyesore. It looked much better during the late 19th century though, when its exterior was painted with a black and white checkered pattern. Designs like this, known as razzle-dazzle camouflage, were meant to confuse enemies when it came to calculating a structure's dimensions, position, and/or distance. The structure consists of 2 floors and a basement that housed 100 chambers, including living quarters. During World War I, the fort operated as a naval signaling station, but it saw limited action due to the heavy buildup of British military defenses in the area at the time. It was also used during World War II and sustained significant damage during airstrikes. The Palmerston Forts were promptly taken out of service when the conflict ended. Horse Sand Fort has been vacant ever since. In fact, the only reason it hasn't been demolished is because it would cost more than just letting it sit there. It reportedly sold to an unnamed buyer in 2021, but it's unclear what the new owner plans to do with it. 7. Ross Island. In 1857, civilians rebelled against British colonial rule in India. The uprising was still going on the following year when the country's jails became overcrowded with rebels, prompting colonial authorities to begin scouting for a place to build a penal colony to house prisoners that were arrested in the revolt. They ultimately settled on a handful of small islands in the remote Andaman and Nicobar Islands, located 800 miles, 1,287.5 kilometers from the Indian mainland. It ensured that there was nowhere for prisoners to escape, and that the inmates couldn't receive any help from members of the movement on the outside. The prisoners' administration was headquartered on a tiny landmass measuring less than 1/3 of a square mile, 0.85 square kilometers, known as Ross Island. Inmates spent years being forced to clear trees and build dozens of Victorian-style buildings, including a church and an extravagant bungalow for the penitentiary's commissioner. The island also had tennis courts, a swimming pool, a ballroom, and lavish gardens to ensure that the highest-ranking staff members and their families were comfortable living in a place that most officials considered a punishment to be assigned to. In contrast, thousands of prisoners lived in deplorable conditions. They were malnourished, overworked, and exposed to diseases like malaria, dysentery, and cholera. They were even forcefully experimented on with malaria drugs that often made them extremely sick and depressed. Their living quarters were horrible, and most of them had leaking roofs. Enforcing discipline only became more difficult for the British as India's movement for freedom grew throughout the early 20th century. A massive 3-story jail was built at nearby Port Blair, and in 1937, the Ross Island Penal Colony closed its doors. India's fight for independence continued for another 10 years before the colonial government was officially disbanded. Today, the buildings at Ross Island are derelict and overgrown, standing as an eerie reminder of the abundant luxury colonial leaders lived in, while committing horrific atrocities against freedom fighters and political prisoners. 6. Ukivok. In the northern Bering Sea, roughly 40 miles, 64 kilometers west of Cape Douglas in Alaska, there's a small landmass with steep rocky cliffs on all sides. Known as King Island, it doesn't look like the type of place anyone would want to live, let alone royalty. But it was once the home of a settlement called Ukivok, where around 400 members of the Inupiat group of indigenous Alaskans spent their winters. Their history on the island impressively dates back over 1,000 years. This group, who called themselves the Asuluk or Ugjuvanmut, survived mainly by whaling and fishing during the summer. Then, when the thick winter ice formed, they traveled to Ukivok and hunted crabs, seals, and walruses, while living in huts that were propped up on stilts along the sloped shoreline. during the mid-20th century, the Bureau of Indian Affairs closed the village's school, reportedly due to the risk of rock slides. Children were then required to stay on the mainland year-round. Without having them on the island to help gather food, Ukivok's residents were left with no choice but to migrate to the Alaskan mainland and make a living there. By 1970, all the residents of King Island had relocated, leaving the entire landmass abandoned. A half-century later, their stilt village still stands, as if it's somehow waiting for them to return, although it's in a visible state of decay. The building that once functioned as its church was dismantled during the 1980s due to the risk of collapse, and some of the remaining structures look like they may be headed toward a similar fate. King Islanders have maintained a distinct cultural identity since moving to the mainland, but occasionally, some of them return to the island to gather food. Other than that, it's remained largely uninhabited. 5. San Giorgio in Alga. Humans began building on the small Italian island of San Giorgio in Alga, or as it's known in English, St. George in the Seaweed, as early as 1000 AD. Located in the Venetian lagoon, it was first home to a Benedictine monastery. Several other monasteries soon popped up, but by the early 15th century, the island was mostly abandoned. In 1404 AD, the monasteries became home to a small community of Augustinian monks who headed a congregation called the Canons Regular of San Giorgio in Alga. Over the next 2 centuries, the group played an essential role in reforming monastic life in northern Italy. But unfortunately, religious life on the island came to an end in 1717, when a catastrophic fire destroyed most of its buildings. During the 18th century, when Venice fell under Austrian rule, a political prison was established on the island. It mostly housed Venetian prisoners who were unhappy with the fact that they were now under Austrian leadership. By World War I, San Giorgio in Alga was back under Italian control, and the Italian military built bunkers on the island. But oddly enough, they were never used. During World War II, the Italians and Germans used the island as a secret training base for free-diving frogmen, who were trained to attach bombs to enemy ships and lay mines. To avoid detection, they only practiced at night, under the cover of darkness. The island was once again abandoned after the war, and has remained in a state of disuse ever since. Several of its buildings are in ruins from being bombed during World War II, while others are in a state of natural decay as they succumb to the effects of time and neglect. Included among the crumbling remains is a 15th century church that was renovated after the 1717 fire. Most of the military and religious artifacts that were left behind have been removed by visitors, leaving only the dilapidated structures behind. Have you ever considered joining a monastery or know anyone who has? Let us know in the comments below, but first be sure to hit that subscribe button. 4. Goalie Otok. 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers, off the Croatian coast in the Adriatic Sea, there's a barren, desolate island that was once home to a top-secret Yugoslavian political prison that was described by its inmates as a living hell. Known as Goalie Otok, the island was an ideal location for isolating the prison population and avoiding the prying eyes of the public. Nicknamed the Croatian Alcatraz, Goalie Otok operated as a prison and labor camp from 1949 to 1989. Only men were housed there, but female prisoners experienced similarly dismal conditions at a prison on the nearby island of Sveti Grugor. Goalie Otok functioned specifically as a political prison up until 1956. It was more or less a dumping ground for accused Stalinists, Soviet sympathizers, and anyone who spoke out against Yugoslavian dictator Josip Broz Tito. Inmates were worked nearly to death as they were forced to quarry tunnels and build the very fortifications that they languished in. They were also put through a so-called re-education regimen that involved severe punishment against any staff members suspected of being an enemy of Tito's regime. The horrors of Goalie Otok spread to the mainland, where the civilians grew to live in constant fear of being taken away by the Yugoslavian secret police for saying or doing even the tiniest thing wrong. Prisoners who made it back to the mainland from Goalie Otok were terrified but silent, because they'd already lived to experience the horror of Croatian Alcatraz, and they hoped to never go through it again. 3. Okunoshima. Located 2 miles (3.2 kilometers) off the coastal city of Takehara in Japan's Seto Inland Sea, Okunoshima, better known as Usagi-jima or Rabbit Island, is famous for its population of friendly wild rabbits who approach humans without hesitation. But it has a dark history, starting with a chemical munitions plant that was built on the island in 1927. Operated by the Imperial Japanese Army Institute of Science and Technology, it was used in a secret program to develop chemical weapons. Japanese authorities went out of their way to keep the plant's existence a secret, even though it wasn't in violation of the Geneva Protocol, which banned chemical warfare, but not the production of chemical weapons. They chose Okunoshima for its isolation, which allowed them to carry out their experiments far away from prying eyes. The island was also removed from maps to avoid having anyone find out about it. Throughout its operation, the plant produced thousands of tons of mustard gas, phosphine, and other toxic chemicals. They were tested on rabbits, which may explain the presence of the abundant modern-day population that attracts thousands of visitors every year. The plant is believed to have been the only facility of its kind in Japan, which means that it made all of the gas that was used against Chinese soldiers and civilians throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Allied soldiers discovered the site after the war ended and subsequently dumped a large amount of the poison gas into the sea. The ruins of the old factory still stand today, and the island is home to a museum dedicated to educating people about the role the plant's activities played in the war. 2. Palmyra Atoll. Halfway between American Samoa and the Hawaiian Islands in the Central Pacific, there's a remote chain of atolls and coral islands called the Northern Line Islands. One of them, known as the Palmyra Atoll, is named after a ship that wrecked on its surrounding reef in 1802. The ship's crew observed no signs of previous human habitation, and it's unclear whether any settlements ever existed there. From 1862 to 1898, Palmyra was part of the Hawaiian Kingdom. It only became an American territory when the US annexed Hawaii. And in 1922, a wealthy family leased the island and harvested its coconuts in order to manufacture coconut oil. The US Navy established a presence on the atoll in 1939, marking the beginning of the only period where permanent residents lived on Palmyra. 2 years later, the Palmyra Island Naval Air Station opened its doors. The Navy made extensive changes to the landscape by blasting a ship canal, building roads to connect islands, and paving a runway. They even built new islands and expanded existing islands with dredged coral. Before leaving Palmyra in 1947, the military demolished some buildings while leaving others intact. Since the war, most of the visitors to the island have been scientific researchers. It remained under private ownership until the year 2000, when the Nature Conservancy bought most of the territory for coral reef conservation research. There's still a handful of cabins to accommodate visiting scientists, but they typically only stay for a month or so. 1. Mamula. Once called Rodina, the island known today as Mamula in the Adriatic Sea sits at the entrance to the Bay of Kotor off Montenegro. It got its present name after Austro-Hungarian general Lazarus von Mamula built a large fort on the island in 1853. Occupying roughly 90% of Mamula's surface area, the fort was part of the Austro-Hungarian army's plans to prevent enemies from entering the Bay of Kotor. During World War II, the island fell under the control of the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, who turned the fort into a concentration camp. It mostly housed prisoners from the surrounding area and was known, like most other concentration camps, for torturing and committing other atrocities against its captives. Records are scarce, but at least 130 deaths have been associated with the concentration camp at Mamula, most of which resulted from starvation. The fort was abandoned after the war, but it still stands today, along with the ruins of some of the prison cells where thousands of captives were held in. In 2016, the Montenegrin government approved plans to turn Mamula's fort into a luxury hotel and resort. The decision went against the wishes of former prisoners, but those who supported the idea pitched it as a great way to create jobs for the country's growing tourism industry. According to the most recent updates, the Switzerland-based Orascom Development Holding AG has signed a 49-year lease and will fund the controversial project. The company reportedly agreed to build a memorial to the concentration camp victims, but the idea of turning the site into a fun place still doesn't sit well with many. Former prisoners and others who seek to commemorate the island's past would rather see the entire site preserved, both as a memorial and for educational purposes. Which of these islands would you most like to visit? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.